This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy and TNC chapters throughout the western United States. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the last Tuesday of every month throughout 2024, Mountain and Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions in the American West and beyond. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in the West and around the world, visit www.nature.org. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guests today are Heidi Redd and Sue Bellagamba. Heidi is a renowned rancher, conservationist, author, and member of the National Cowgirl Museum's Hall of Fame. Sue serves as Canyonlands Regional Director at the Nature Conservancy, and for more than 30 years she's worked to protect the lands and waters of southeastern Utah. Heidi and TNC have been partners since 1997, when Heidi sold her family's Utah ranch, known as the Dugout Ranch, to the Nature Conservancy in a historic conservation deal that protected the property from impending development. The Dugout Ranch is located at the gateway to Canyonlands National Park and sits within the boundaries of what is now Bears Ears National Monument, a fragile and arid landscape that's faced various development and environmental threats for many decades. Heidi and Sue have worked together in many capacities over the years, with one of their most notable achievements being the creation of the Canyonlands Research Center, which is headquartered at the Dugout Ranch. The Canyonlands Research Center was founded in 2010, and its mission is to promote a sustainable future on the Colorado Plateau for people and nature through research, inspiration, and demonstration of evidence-based solutions to solve some of our most pressing ecological, social, and economic issues. Heidi is also the author of the excellent new book titled A Cowgirl's Conservation Journey, Stories from the Dugout Ranch. The book details her fascinating and adventurous life, with tales ranging from her youth, which included lots of rock climbing and skydiving, to her early years on the Dugout Ranch, all the way up to some recent behind-the-scenes stories from the designation of Bears Ears as a national monument. If you're a fan of history, adventure, ranching, conservation, and purpose-driven people, I know you'll enjoy the book. We covered a lot in this episode, including Heidi's upbringing, her first visit to the Dugout Ranch, and when she knew that she would devote her life to stewarding the Dugout's spectacular landscapes. Sue provides some excellent context around conservation in the American Southwest and why drylands are such a critical ecosystem and focus of TNC's efforts. We talk about how TNC initially built trust with Heidi back in the 1990s, the creation of the Canyonlands Research Center, new insights Heidi gleaned from writing her book, and much more. Be sure to visit the episode notes for links to everything we discuss, including a link to Heidi's book. A huge thanks to Heidi and Sue for taking the time to chat with me and share their wisdom from so many decades of conservation work in such a special part of the country. Hope you enjoy. All right, Heidi and Sue, I'm so excited to be chatting with you, as is the case with all these TNC interviews. I just love preparing for them. And in this case, I got an awesome book in the mail that I loved reading and preparing, that helped me prepare even more for this. Heidi, your amazing book that came out earlier this year, A Cowgirl's Conservation Journey. And I would just straight off the bat encourage everybody to go ahead and order the book, because everybody that listens to this podcast will love it. There's a link in the episode notes. But for those who have not read the book and have not dug into your backstory, Heidi, I was wondering if you could just start out kind of at the beginning, which I loved reading about your adventurous upbringing. I've got two young daughters, and I loved reading about how your dad helped you kind of embrace your adventurous spirit. But I was wondering if you could just talk about your upbringing and how you eventually made your way to the Dugout Ranch.
Well, I was born in Ogden, Utah, but in 1949, we moved to a small town in Idaho, Blackfoot, Idaho. And what a wonderful move that was in my life. We lived right along the Snake River, a small town. This is in the 40s. And my adventure started, and I always had wanted a horse. I always loved Roy Rogers. Didn't care much for Dale, but I really liked Roy, and always wanted a horse. So I'd jump on my bike and ride out to the auction yard every week, and there would be horses in the pen running around, and I would try to jump off the fence onto them, and of course, that lasted about 2 seconds on the back of the horse, and I was on the ground. The auctioneer always would come out and scurry me out of there and kind of almost throw rocks at me. But one day I was out there, and he brought out this little colt and said, $5 and this is yours. Whoa, was I excited. So I jumped on my bike, went home, got my wagon, went around the neighborhood collecting pop bottles till I had $5. And went back out and said, okay, here it is. And we put a string of baling, almost just a little old thin rope around that horse's neck. And I walked it home. And my parents didn't know anything about this. But we did have an acre in the back of the house. And that was Brownie, a very creative name that I came up with, Brownie. And so he lived in the backyard, and he and I just absolutely were one. I mean, I never owned a saddle. I never had a real bridle. My father made me a makeshift one. But boy, I was one day a wild Indian on this horse, and the next day I was a cowboy. So it was a great life growing up in Idaho.
That's wonderful. I loved reading just about, as I mentioned, about your kind of free spirit, and particularly how your dad encouraged it. And then you had, if I remember correctly, 2 brothers that either you kept them on their toes or vice versa. Can you talk about, I'd love to hear about your kind of first memories of the Dugout Ranch. You write about it so beautifully in the book, but I think for the listeners, could you talk about when you first visited the ranch and kind of both what took you there, but then also kind of your first thoughts at visiting this place that would become really, inseparable from you and part of you?
Well, my adventure, my path to the Dugout started when I was a junior in college. I was in a sorority, and one of my sorority sister's brother knocked on the door, and lucky for me, I answered. And there was this charming young man that had a big smile on his face and gave me a great hello, and of course wanted to know where he could find his sister. Well, from that introduction, he and I became very close friends. He had just been to Alaska learning to climb with the National Guard. And so off we went. I had a little sports car, and off we go up, and he taught me some climbing tricks. And so we were good friends for many years. After I graduated from college, I had spent, about 7 months in Europe just with a backpack, hiking around actually started in Scandinavia and ended up in Africa. And then upon coming home, and the whole time when I was in college, would ski with a bunch of fellows. They were all ski patrolmen. And one day, one evening after we'd finished skiing and we were heading home, they were talking about scuba diving under the ice in Bear Lake. And I said, whoa, I want to do that. And I have scuba diving gear because I've been scuba diving since I was 12. So, and this was another instances of my father never thinking any difference between my 2 older brothers and I. If I wanted to do it, I could do it. So when I was 12, I did get this scuba diving equipment. But so that led to, I went with the fellows up, and they cut a big hole in the ice. We all had lead ropes because once you get under that ice, it was 3 or 4, at least 3 feet thick.
Yeah.
And we were going to go look at the Cisco Run, which is a special fish that makes a run in Bear Lake. And so after that adventure and coming out on the ice, and we were standing there around the fire, they mentioned that they were going to go skydiving the next day. And I said, I don't have a parachute or anything, but I'd like to do that. So met him at the airport the next day, and my training was jumping off a chair twice. And then they showed me, how you pull the ripcord. And so 198 jumps later, I did a lot of air shows and jumping into reservoirs. And so that was a great adventure. But then getting back to my path to the dugout, Robert, who was my sorority sister's brother, invited me to come to the dugout. He picked me up at the airport in Moab. I was teaching school in Salt Lake at that time. And I can remember the journey through the Red Rocks, having never been in this country and just being absolutely overwhelmed with the beauty. And it was a dirt road heading to the dugout. There was 25 miles of dirt road and in a pickup bouncing along and the dust blowing out back of the truck. And then coming down and driving down the switchbacks into Lower Indian Creek, where it was like stepping into a different world, where the wind gates are just right there, magnificent towers. And Robert pulled the truck over and we went through the brush till we came to Newspaper Rock, which had all the ancient petroglyphs. And just feeling the power of those, not only the red rock and those embracing you, but then those ancient messages left on the rock. And although the ancient Puebloans have been gone for so many centuries, but they may have been gone physically, but I can tell you spiritually, they are there. They are walking in those canyons. And I've always felt that after taking over the dugout and running it, that if I respected this land and took care of this land, that someday I would be allowed to walk with them in protecting this out long after I had left this earth.
That's beautiful. I've up until a few years ago, I'd never had an experience like that, but it was actually on a Nature Conservancy owned property here in Colorado called the J.E. Canyon Ranch, where there was a similar, some similar area that used to be used, I think, for cooking and grinding grain, I think. And I remember touching, it was kind of in this cave, and I remember touching the part and knowing that people, so many centuries, if not millennia ago, had been touching that same thing. And it really was a powerful feeling that I'll never forget. And that was just one dose of it, and I just can't imagine what you felt being so connected to that place for so many decades. I was wondering if there's a specific moment when you knew that you never wanted to leave that place and that you wanted to devote your life to that place, or was it more of a accumulation of experiences over the years? When you think back to the time when you decided, like, all right, this is my life's work. This is what I put on earth to do. Could you talk about how you kind of came to that way of thinking?
I think that first encounter coming down onto Indian Creek, onto the creek and going down and traveling through that canyon, of course, was very dramatic and will always be etched in my memory as if it happened yesterday. And then, of course, we grazed on 356,000 acres of BLM and forest lands as well as private. And when you spend all those almost 60 years cowboying and knowing every canyon, where every water hole is, and you see these ancient dwellings as well as all the rock art, and you become one with Mother Nature when you're working from daylight till dark, and you experience the smells and the feeling of morning air and the birds waking up and all the animals. It's like a rebirth of every morning of everything waking up. And then you're through the day when it gets hot. So you're feeling exactly what those rocks are feeling. what the earth is feeling. It's from the coolness of morning to the heat of the day to the cooling gentleness of evening. And it is very powerful. And when you spend 7 days a week doing that for most of your life, adult life, it's very powerful.
Well, one thing I would love, we're kind of skipping through things. And again, I encourage people to read the book because there's obviously this deep reverence you have for the landscape. But one of the things I loved about the book was the deep reverence you have for so many of the people that have been involved in the ranch over the years. And I just think that, and I think when you think about the Nature Conservancy, a lot of, when you look at their conservation work, so much of that is based on people and relationships. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the moment when you took the reins of the ranch, because I think you write about it. It is beautiful the way you write about it. Now, there's a quote in there. There's so many great quotes in the book, and there's one that says that I'd never heard before. A woman is like a tea bag. You never know how strong she is until she gets in hot water, by Eleanor Roosevelt. And I love Theodore Roosevelt, so I love reading that quote. And then you also talk about how you've never really operated from a fear-based mentality. You say you operate from from love and from obligation, but you've never really thought about things through a prism of fear. And could you just talk a bit about kind of your mindset when it became clear that this ranch going forward was going to be your obligation?
Well, I did have a lot of people because it's one of the biggest ranches in San Juan County, and at one time one of the bigger ranches in Utah. And I had a lot of people say, "Oh, wow, how do you dare do that?" And I thought, "What do you mean? How would I dare do this? What is the difference between me and a cowboy?" But I always knew that I had an ally in the land. I always knew I wasn't there alone. I had those ancient ones riding with me. I had the old cowboys riding with me. And I had young men working with me that loved and were as loyal to the brand as I was. And I won't say that there weren't hard times. And the first time I owed money when I took over, and when I went to the banker and he wanted to say, "Hey," I said, "Okay, I owe this $80,000 and Robert and I had this debt together and now I'm taking it over." And of course he said, "Well, what do you have for collateral?" And I said, "Well, I've got cattle." And I had 100 times more cattle that would cover that debt. But he said, no, I need more than just your cattle. I want your securities. And I said, "Well, now wait a minute. What are you even going to charge me for that?" And it was far more than my brokerage firm was charging me. So I just looked at him, gathered up my papers, and walked out. And so I thought, okay, I went down the street to another banker and told him what I needed. And there was absolutely nothing like highway robbery. It was, well, we'll need at least this many cattle, and that's it. And I got the check, $80,000, and walked over to the other bank and paid off that loan. But I must say that I had so many positive experiences with fellow ranchers and other people, the Marlboro crew that I worked with for years, that one experience is kind of an anomaly. It isn't what I face daily. I found that people were really, and especially the cowboys I worked with, we had wonderful times, adventures. We had hard work. We had long days, but we always said, I never have to wait for the weekend to enjoy life. I can enjoy it every day.
Well, yeah, that comes through so clearly in the book, both your love for the work as well as all of your partners' love for the work. And then just that mutual respect and kind of a mutual no nonsense toughness. I think, I think that it seemed from everything that I was reading in the book that I think over time, it seems that folks attract like-minded people. And I feel like you really just attracted so many like-minded folks that were on the same page as far as their love of the land, conservation, and this mission to keep the place going. And speaking of that, there were a lot of threats to the property over many years. I mean, from energy development to real estate development. And that's kind of the threat of real estate development is what brought in your eventual partnership with the Nature Conservancy, which is just really a case study in a win-win-win. Could you talk a bit about when the Nature Conservancy kind of entered your consciousness? I know you had, in the book you write that you had heard about them, but when did they become a potential solution for some of the challenges you were facing?
Well, the biggest challenge I faced after quite a few years, maybe even 10 years of running the ranch, was Robert, rightfully so. And he wasn't being anything but wanting his share of the property. I had tried to pay him off, but boy, when you're in the cattle business, you're lucky if you can, and I was doing a lot of other things like commercials to try to boost my income as well. But one day there's a knock on my door. It was a real estate agent from Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And he had his fancy cowboy hat on and said he was there to sell the ranch, at least a portion of it. And my heart just sank. But that was, it isn't a time that you sit and wring your hands and say, woe is me. This is a time that you pony up and get with the program and see that this doesn't happen. And luckily for me, I was on the board of Canyonlands Field Institute. And this was maybe my second meeting, and I was sitting looking at the agenda, overhearing a conversation with Chris Montague, who worked for the Nature Conservancy. And he was telling that they had just purchased a ranch for conservation. And when I heard ranch and conservation, I knew I had my answer. And so I asked Chris after the meeting if we could have coffee. And then a few years later, there was a lot of conversation, a lot of the back and forth. But that was, and I feel that it was, maybe those ancient ones were right there too, and after a lot of negotiations and the family agreeing, then we sold to the Nature Conservancy. And I kept the herd and the permits at that time. And I leased them back is what I did. And paid for the leases every year. And so I could continue on the work that I was doing. But the real benefit to the ranch was what the Nature Conservancy could bring. And one of the biggest things that I felt they brought was our Science Research Center at the ranch. And what a difference that can make in the future of not only the Dugout Ranch, but a lot of ranches in the Colorado Plateau area. And that's something that Sue Bellagamba can expand on.
One other question about your initial dealings with the Nature Conservancy, because I've been talking with folks. I think this may be the 20th episode I've done with featuring TNC, and there's always a lot of discussion in every episode about building relationships, building partnerships. But the vast majority of the conversations we had are the TNC people talking about how they go about building the relationship, whether it's with landowners or stakeholders or tribal nations. And so I'd love to hear from your perspective, what was it about TNC and their approach that made you trust them? Because I think, there's a long history in the West of, when it comes to real estate, people coming with kind of slickster ideas about how they're going to help you out with this and that. And sometimes a lot of promises without much delivery. And so from a landowner's perspective, what was it that gave you confidence that these people are serious about forming a real partnership?
Well, first of all, their track record on conservation and land conservation, while that was primary and really made a difference to me, it was also their sense of community with people. It wasn't separating the people that worked on the land and the land. They cared for both. And that made a big difference. It was working with a community. When they bought the place, they wouldn't have had to have paid taxes being a nonprofit. But knowing that the community and that makes a difference whether you're paying taxes or not. And they paid taxes, and they acknowledged and never diminished the rancher or the local people. Sometimes in conservation, they feel like the people that work on the land are the enemy, not the Nature Conservancy. They had a strong tie not only to the land, but the people working on the land and the people in the communities also. So that made a very big difference to me, that the people that had worked on the land could continue that, and that it wouldn't be just, okay, now we've got it and we aren't going to be running cattle or working with the local people. That made a big difference to me.
That's great. Sue, I'd love to hear from your perspective, kind of what was so attractive about this particular property to TNC. I mean, it's obvious that it's a one-of-a-kind landscape in this unbelievably beautiful place that's only gotten more important over time. And I don't know if you were actually around at TNC when this project got started, but could you just speak a bit from TNC's perspective on this and what an opportunity it was?
Sure. So I was around when the Nature Conservancy purchased the Dugout Ranch, and it was really the vision of the Redd family, Heidi and Robert and their two sons, Matt and Adam, that allowed us to partner with them and purchase the ranch in 1997. We saw it as a really important ecological and biological piece of property. It's got critical habitat for Mexican spotted owl. There's 4 or 5 different rare plants that are located on the grazing allotments and the private property there. Also, it's got amazingly healthy riparian areas from the top of the Bajos down to the ranch. There's really great cottonwood galleries and forests there that, of course, host a bunch of migratory birds. So it was really one of the largest projects we had taken on at the time. But I am so glad that Chris Montague and Dave Livermore, our state director at the time, decided to take the risk, because the partnership for the last 25, 26 years has been one of the greatest joys of my work at the Nature Conservancy.
Well, and so much has happened since, that initial purchase, the Canyonlands Research Center, which I want to talk a lot about. But what was the plan at that point when you initially bought it? I mean, was there any idea about anything similar to the Canyonlands Research Center, or what was the thought on how TNC would kind of work with the Redd family and with this property going forward?
Yeah, I think our hope was that Heidi would be around forever.
Yeah.
And that she would continue to lease the ranch and run the cattle herd, and we would just kind of be her landlords. However, there was a time that Heidi decided she wanted to step aside and hand over the management to her son, Matt Redd, who is now a Nature Conservancy employee. And so that really opened the door for us to think a little bit bigger. For the Nature Conservancy, we feel purchasing properties is really the first step. We really want to think about how can we leverage our preserves in a way that we can make a difference beyond its borders. And there were scientists that were doing some research around Canyonlands National Park and around the grazing allotments at that time. But we realized that this land could be so much more than just a cattle ranch. And I don't mean just a cattle ranch, because it's an incredibly successful cattle ranch. But it also gave us an opportunity to really look at high-level scientific research and indigenous partnerships. And so it was probably about 15 years ago that many of our partners and the Nature Conservancy, and once again, really the vision of Heidi Redd, allowed us to create what we call the Canyonlands Research Center, which is headquartered at Dugout Ranch.
And can you tell me more about the mission and just kind of what the purpose of the CRC is?
Yeah, our goal is a big one. Our vision is really to create a sustainable future for people and nature on the Colorado Plateau. And so we're looking at a lot of different science that looks at the interactive effects of land use and climate change. Back when we bought the ranch, I don't think anybody really even uttered the words climate change, but now we know it's one of the biggest threats and it knows no borders, it knows no boundaries. So how can we help people who depend on the lands and waters of the Colorado Plateau adapt to climate change? And so some of our research is like which grasses are going to do better in a hotter and warmer world, because if we understand that, and if the land managers understand that, we will have a better success rate as we go to restore these lands. We're also looking at different types and breeds and hybrid breeds of cattle that could possibly be lighter on the land, leaner meat. They'll roam further for water, so they're probably doing maybe less overgrazing in certain areas. And that is really through a partnership with many people, Utah State University, New Mexico, University of New Mexico, and the Jornada Experimental Range in southern New Mexico too. And that's just a handful of the type of research we're doing. We also really understand that science is one type of knowledge. We're really looking at all types of knowledge, including evidence-based knowledge, which would be local knowledge. Where else can you get scientists sitting around a campfire and talking to a rancher that's been on the land for 60 years and looking at the differences that they're seeing? A lot of research projects are time limited. You get funded for maybe 2 or 3 years. But at the Canyonlands Research Center, we have Heidi Redd and Matt Redd, who have been there for decades. And that's really instrumental in helping to understand how these systems are changing with climate change. And then, of course, we have our indigenous partners, too, that have indigenous knowledge to bring to the table, too.
Heidi, I'd love to hear from you about climate change, because I'd never really thought about it. And so you just mentioned this, but you were talking about the threats to the ranch over the decades. And for the longest time, it was threats that were kind of bound by property lines. But the way you describe climate change is kind of this threat that's really an overlay over entire massive landscapes, and it doesn't pay any attention to anybody's property lines. I just never thought about it in that terms, and that was very interesting for me to think about it that way. Could you tell me about when climate change first came on your radar?
Probably about 15 years ago, and it's an interesting process in that a lot of time people think, well, this isn't climate change because this winter, good heavens, look at this, we have 3 feet of snow on the ground, or it has rained this spring. But it isn't, nothing is consistent. And so it is this flow where you start seeing maybe the Indian rice grass isn't as plentiful as it was, or the sand drop seed, or so it's not a process that it's a little bit of a trick, because it does fool you, because one year you think, oh my gosh, this is the end. And then, whoa, here it comes next year, and you make it through. So working with the scientists, and this is the wonderful thing about all of us that work on the ranch as either a farmhand or a cowboy, is that we have access to these scientists to visit and pick their minds about what's going on, as well as they can pick our minds and know what was happening in the 60s and what happened in the 70s and the progress and so climate change is this slow moving turtle. And sometimes it's really a race, it's fast, but definitely the one thing I feel with the Science Center is if there's a way to get ahead of it, if there's a way that we can continue to grow food for the nation, we'll learn it this way. And the one thing about the cattle that Sue just mentioned that we're studying is they also are like a deer. They will not only eat grass, but they'll eat the forbs. And so to have them like a deer that can go from either one, if the grass isn't there, they can eat the forbs or maybe not hit the grass as hard. So it is an important study, and my son has been the lead person at the ranch on that. And so it's been very interesting. And one thing about letting go of the reins, when I'm in my 80s now, and I was in my mid to late 70s when I kind of put up the spurs. I really never put up the spurs, but recognizing that there's so much from a young perspective. I mean, I know the ranch and every inch of it and this and that, but to have new eyes on the same picture that I've looked at for 60 years makes a big difference. And that is the one thing about change that is very important, that we don't figure that we can. And I'm still at the ranch and I'm still participating in ways, but it is important to have new blood and new vision. And my son and his wife bring that to the ranch, along with all the researchers and all the people that work for the Nature Conservancy. So it's a wonderful team, and it's a broad-based team, which we are very, very lucky because not all ranches have this. And so it's our responsibility for what we learn to get it out to other ranchers and other landholders.
Well, that brings me to another question I had. It's unfortunate because it seems like the term climate change has just become, in some circles, just a political, almost like a political signal. And I'm very lucky. I rarely get any negative feedback on this podcast, but on the rare instances that I do, it's somebody makes a comment about that I've been brainwashed by climate change people. And so as a leader, both in your landscape and then nationally, globally. I mean, you just recently were inducted into the National Cowgirl Hall of Fame. I mean, you're a person that people look to for, wisdom. How do you have that conversation with people about the climate changing, about things getting hotter, drier, without in a productive manner? Because you strike me as somebody who's very no nonsense, but also very good with people. And so how do you kind of walk that line these days, given how wound up everybody is?
Well, I feel that, and I've been on a lot of committees for a lot of different things. And one thing I've learned is if you go into a conversation figuring you have all the cards, you have all the knowledge, and that you want all of the pie, you don't want to share this pie, then they won't listen to you. And I do not have all the answers. I do not know what really is going to happen in 10 years. I can pretty much guess that it's going to be a lot different than it is today. But I do not have an exact idea. But I can tell you that everything, it's like putting money in the bank. You put money in the bank because you don't know what's going to happen next year. What's the cattle market going to be? Well, I figure that our study on climate change is putting money in the bank, because the more we learn now and the more we can spread the word, then we are putting money in the bank so that we will survive. And if we don't pay attention and learn all we can about what could happen and what might happen, and maybe then we're really going to be in trouble, because we will have spent all our money and here comes the bank after you. So it just behooves us to pay attention. What does it hurt to listen to what the researchers, the scientists are telling us, and put some of those practices to use? It isn't going to hurt us at all. And I don't know why we should get angry about the term climate change. I mean, we've had the hottest summers. Doesn't this tell you something? We've had the hottest summers on record last year and coming up again this year. So that means a lot. That means a lot. And it means a lot that we're losing our icebergs and our glaciers. So I just think that we don't have to be antagonistic about climate change. Let's learn what we can and take what we can from what we learn so that we can continue to have food and fiber.
I agree with you. I completely agree. And I feel like I've said this on the podcast before, but one of the reasons I started this thing was because I used to live in Boulder, Colorado, and I was in the real estate business working with a lot of ranchers. And one day I'd be out on a ranch with a 5th generation rancher who politically, if you were to write down his political affiliations, he'd be pretty far out on the right side of things. And then my next door neighbor in Boulder was big time environmentalist on the far left. And I realized that they shared about 85% of the same ideas about dealing with the land and landscapes. It's just they use different words. And that was one of the reasons I want to start this podcast, is to show there's a lot more in common than different. And that was in 2016 when things were getting crazy. So back to you for a second. As I was preparing for this conversation, I learned so much about drylands and about their importance globally for food production, for populations. And I was wondering if you could just give the listeners a bit of a lesson on why drylands are so important and such a focus of the Nature Conservancy's work.
Sure. So our scientists tell me that dryland ecosystems occupy about 40% of the Earth's land surface, and they also support about 38% of its human populations. So that's worldwide. Here on the Colorado Plateau and in Utah, we're actually a semi-arid drylands, but they're really where a significant part of our food and fiber, like Heidi said, is grown and raised. And so they're really, really important to us. They also, of course, have a whole bunch of unique plant and animal species that have been adapted to the conditions in these drylands. About 20% of the major centers of global plant diversity and over 30% of the designated endemic bird areas are in drylands. So we think a lot about different type of ecosystems around the world, but for us in Utah, especially on the Colorado Plateau, we're totally focused on these really iconic landscapes. And they're also incredibly beautiful. They're characterized by these rugged and remote rangelands, deeply carved canyons, as Heidi said. We have these volcanic, isolated mountains. So our grazing allotments really start high up in the Bajos at about 12,000 feet and go all the way down to the Colorado River at about 4,000 feet. So it gives us this great gradient to look at different elevations and different species that need those different ecosystems to survive.
Another interesting part about this particular ranch and everything we've been talking about is that the ranch is located right in the middle of one of the most kind of public and well-known public lands issues over the last decade, I'd say, and that's everything with Bears Ears. And when you're thinking about, obviously a big portion of this ranch is public land allotments, and then there's also the privately deeded land. I'd love to hear from either of you or both of you about how that the struggle with Bears Ears and then the designation and then kind of the back and forth that played out over years. I'd love to hear more about how that, what concerned you about that, how that could have affected the ranch, either negatively or positively, just kind of how the operation and the conservation values were affected by that. I'd call it a battle, I guess.
Well, in the 60s, when the Needles District of Canyonlands was enacted, that park, all that was part of the ranch, that Needles District of Canyonlands National Park. That was all part of the ranch. And Robert and I were in our 20s, and we had just purchased and paid for all those permits. Plus, we had private acres in that area, in the park. And so when they were talking about establishing the park, it was kind of like, took our breath away. But, a fellow by the name of Bates Wilson, who was the park superintendent, he would come down and talk with us, and every trip he took dignitaries on into the park or into the area. At that time, it wasn't a park. He would invite us along. So we felt part of this preserving that area. We weren't left outside the discussion, which really made a difference. And so in the end, they gave us a 10-year phase out. So we ran cattle in the park until 1976. Then they took our in-holding our land. We tried to get them to let us keep it and promised we would never develop it. But I understand that, that in-holding wouldn't have been a good thing for them. So that was in the 60s. So then the Bears Ears. Now we're completely in the Bears Ears. Now we're in in-holding. And so when they were first proposing it and the county was against it, they formed a committee. Bob Bishop, who was senator in Utah, said, well, why don't you let these 7 counties decide their fate with public lands? And Obama and Secretary Sally Jewell said, okay, we'll give you a chance and see what you can do. So I was on a committee representing the cattlemen in San Juan County. And then we had the ATV people, we had the mining people, we had the business people, anyone that was affected by the land and citizens. And so our first few meetings, it was a little bit chaotic and a little bit like I was saying, no one recognized, and we needed to recognize that we needed to work together and that no one was going to come out with the whole pie. And nor should they. And so through 2 years of hard work and drawing up plans where mining would be allowed, where cattle ranching would be, where ATVs would be, we took this plan to every community in, as well as on the reservation, took these 3 plans and had them vote on which one. At the end, we sent it to Bob Bishop, which was the Death Star. Because once he got it, then everybody else jumped in and started saying, well, this and that and the other. And then it never did get through Congress. And what it effectively did was delay Obama naming the monument in a fashion in a long enough time that then they would have their ducks in a row for protecting it. Because once that monument, because of all the publicity that was made of it, was announced, there were bumper-to-bumper cars in the area. So it was a little bit frightening because of all of the ancient dwellings, the rock art sites, everything that is so fragile, plus the desert, was being just absolutely overrun. And so that was a tough thing. I had wished that it could have been a conservation area or wilderness, but good luck getting wilderness.
Yeah. So anything to add to that from the Nature Conservancy standpoint?
So the Nature Conservancy really is an organization that tries to lift all boats and work very collaboratively. So we worked for years on the Public Lands Initiative with Rob Bishop. Heidi represented San Juan County. I was in committee meetings with Grand County, Emery County, Carbon County. But like Heidi said, we were unable to get it across the finish line. And that allowed Secretary Jewell and President Obama to create a national monument that really was what the indigenous communities and the tribes had hoped for all along. So conservation is a good thing, and conservation that works with co-management for our indigenous communities is even a better thing. It's been difficult with the back and forth between creating the monument, shrinking the monument, recreating the monument, because it's been hard for the land management agencies to actually create their resource management plans. And so a lot of things have been kind of put on hold through that battle, which is unfortunate. And as Heidi said, it has increased visitation. And so my hope is really that we're able to fund the land management agencies, especially the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, so that they actually have the staff to enforce the regulations, protect the ancient dwellings, the rock art, the biological resources that we all really care about.
Heidi, one question for you about writing the book. You strike me both in this conversation and then from reading the book, you're an action-oriented person. You're always going. And I kind of chuckle when you said hang up the spurs before you then said you never really hang up the spurs, because you just strike me as somebody that is go, 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 taking care of business, getting things done. And I was curious when you sat down to really reflect on your life and your work and all this, just amazing accomplishments you've had. Did you have any realizations? Did you kind of come to any new conclusions? Did you think about something? Was there anything that was a surprise that came into your mind through the process of reflecting back on everything you've done?
It's interesting. And I think maybe a lot of people my age are looking back over their lives. And it was a journey in time. And I must say that it really did reawaken all the wonderful, wonderful experiences I've had through my life and how lucky I've been. And telling the story, for one thing, I'm not a person that likes to sit in a room and type.
I figured that.
And to figure out, first of all, how do I save this on a computer? And I had a lot of really good help with that. And so writing my stories, that I started out on remembering everything about that adventure, from the weather to my feelings to really trying to get it accurate, because memories I can be on a bucking horse and feel one thing, and you can be watching that bucking horse and see another thing. So it was a truly amazing adventure for me to try to write this book. And I must say that Larissa Bowen, bless her heart, she is the editor. And I tell you, she took this cowgirl's words and she put spit and shine on them. She really is an amazing gal. And Carl Trujillo, who did the layout of the pictures, it was a team effort, and believe me, those two people just did an amazing job of making this book what it is, and I'm very, very thankful for both of them.
It really is an amazing book, and it's just got beautiful photography, and I'm so glad that your family, took such care to keep all these photos and everything, because it's such a historical record of really a part of the world. Obviously I've been to Moab and some of the national parks, but I just didn't have a deep enough appreciation for everything, obviously, that your family did, but really just a lot of the history of the landscape down there. And believe me, I get a lot of books. I got 3 books in the mail today from different publishers. I don't know what they think what's going to happen if I read it, but I see a lot of books, and this one is just great. And I echo your praise for Larissa, because she helped me a lot as I was preparing for this interview. So quite a dream team you were working with on that. One more question about the ranch in the future. The book is dedicated to your grandchildren, which I thought was really cool. And you mentioned your son and your daughter-in-law are now working at the Canyonlands Research Center. What are your hopes, if you even have any, or thoughts about your family and their involvement with whether it's this particular ranch or just working close with the land, protecting the land, living kind of purpose-driven lives as you have? Do you have any wishes for them?
Well, what I know about them is that both my sons and their families will always, it's like I say in the book, all the years I spent at the dugout, and, I've never owned the dugout. The dugout has always owned me. And my family, I feel the same way, that they will always be owned by the dugout and their experiences there. And like the Native Americans, you never own land. And I think that's an important lesson to learn from them. And one of the things that I feel strongly is that I hope that I can tell my love story of the dugout and what it means to me. And I hope that every person has their own dugout, whether it's their backyard, whether it's their favorite place to go hiking, whether it's the park down the street, that they have some piece of land that is in their heart and soul that makes them part of that land and they feel it. That would be my hope.
I love it. I've got two quick questions to wrap this up for both of you. Heidi, I'll start with you. It seems that you read a lot, and that reading has been an important part of your life. And there's so many amazing quotes, many of that I'd never seen and that I highlighted. I wrote all over the beautiful book you sent me, but I'm gonna continue to refer back. And so I was wondering, and there's also a lot of mention of Wallace Stegner. There's so many amazing book references. So I was wondering, Heidi, if you could just give a few books that have been important in your life. They could be about ranching, could be about conservation, or they could just be books that have hit you hard and have kind of helped you become the person that you are.
Well, the first one that comes to mind is Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire.
Yeah, that's perfect.
It is a journey into the heart of the Red Rock. And I think it's very beautifully written, and his feelings. I must say, of all his books, it's the one where I think he touches the heart of the soil and the red rocks. The other book that really made a difference when I first did the dugout. At the dugout, we have to have our own generator. We never had television. We never had telephones or anything because we were off grid. We had a generator. And so we did a lot of reading. But the one other book that really made a difference to me was Frank Waters' book on the Hopi. And, the Hopi, there's the Mother Earth and the Father Sky. And just the feeling that they have and the respect they have for the land, and that they feel a responsibility towards the land. And that book really that was another book that both those two books had a real impact on my life.
Those are great. Thank you. Sue?
Well, I'll mention two books. And the first, I'll start out with the title, Blow Sand in His Soul, Bates Wilson, The Heart of Canyonlands, by Jen Jackson Quintano. And Heidi mentioned Bates Wilson. He really is the father of Canyonlands. He had a huge vision to protect the whole canyon country all the way down to the San Juan River. And he was able to do that with his Dutch oven diplomacy. It's a testament to a singular love of place. Reminds me a lot of Heidi and her love of Dugout Ranch, and really how he was able to transcend the political divide. And if we had more Bates Wilsons today, we might not be in the place we are today. So that's a great book. And then, of course, Wallace Stegner and Beyond the 100th Meridian, which is all about John Wesley Powell's journey down the Colorado River. And as an old river ranger, river rat, that really speaks to me. And looking into the future about how John Wesley Powell kind of warned long ago about the dangers of developing the West and what will happen, it's pretty telling of our future and where we are today.
Those are both great. And last question for you both. You both have really devoted your lives to this region, this such a special and fragile region of our country. And you've both, devoted it to lives of purpose and leaving the world better than you found it. And that's really a common theme with so many people I have on this podcast. And so I always like to get any parting words of wisdom. If you got something to ask of the listeners, just any way to wrap it up. And Sue, maybe we'll start with you on that.
Sure. I have been so fortunate to have a career following my passion, which is really the lands and waters of the Colorado Plateau and the Colorado River. So my advice is find your passion, follow it, and you will have a wonderful career and a great life.
I love it. Heidi?
I would just say stand up for the land and protect it.
You are the example of that. Both of y'all are. And it's just really a real honor to chat with you. I say this all the time, and I don't know if people think I'm just like blowing smoke or something, but I'm just so honored to get to know folks like y'all, and it's so inspiring. And I think of myself when I was 23 years old, just doing what I thought I was supposed to do, which was wear a suit and go work at Merrill Lynch. And I would read articles in Outside Magazine about people like y'all doing this important work. And now my job is getting to talk to people like you. It's really a dream come true. And, I'm a much better person for it, as are so many of the people that listen. So thank you all for taking the time. Thank you for everything you do. And I hope we can meet in person one of these days.
You're always welcome at the Dugout.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.